Well, our journey through the 23rd Psalm has been quite an adventurous journey so far, has it not? This is the fifth session when we are together. And just kind of as a brief recap of where we have been so far with the 23rd Psalm. And by the way, the title of this particular series is The Journey with the Shepherd. And we identified the shepherd very early on, who the shepherd is in the 23rd Psalm. And we've all heard the 23rd Psalm, have we not? Everybody has heard it. In fact, that along with maybe Psalm 1 and Psalm 100 were it's probably one of the first Psalms that you learned in Sunday school and committed to memory. The 23rd Psalm is it's so powerful and it means so much to the life of the believer. But very early on, we learn who the shepherd is. Who is the shepherd in Psalm 23? Yahweh. That's exactly right. With a big L, capital O-R-D. O-R-D will be smaller in font size, but nonetheless, that signifies to the English reader that in the Hebrew text, that is the divine name Yahweh. Now, what's significant about the divine name Yahweh? The covenant, right? The God of the covenant, the God of the Exodus, the God of Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Yahweh is one, the ever-present, ever-faithful one. Psalm 23 is categorized, and we looked at this last spring when we did a survey of the book of Psalms. Psalm 23 is categorized as a psalm of trust. We established this trust and confidence relationship because the Lord is my shepherd. Yahweh is my shepherd. The ever-present, always there, always the same, consistent, never giving up God who created the universe is my shepherd. Last week, we began to discover the effects of the relationship that we have with Yahweh and what kind of effect walking with God has on our lives. And one of the first thing we saw, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing, right? Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. That's Psalm 23:1. Psalm 23:2 begins with, He settles me down in green pastures. You remember this from last week, right? He settles me down in green pastures. We see there the effect that the relationship we have with Yahweh has upon us. And the first thing that we see early on, the first effect is this: He settles me down. When everything is chaotic, when everything is out of order, when everything is cumbersome and burdensome, when I am filled with fear and anxiety and fright and all kinds of things that are bothering me, He settles me down. Like scooping up a young child to rock them back to sleep. That's the effect Yahweh has upon us. I also shared with you that Philip Keller, who years ago wrote a wonderful, wonderful book, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. It's been around a long time, and it's really kind of a standard if you're going to look at and read through Psalm 23. Philip Keller identified that there are 4 things that a sheep needs to be free of in order to settle down. Sheep needs to be free of fear, of friction, because there can be conflict amongst the flock, tension among the flock. A sheep needs to be free of flies or any kind of pest that's coming to bother them. And a sheep needs to be free of hunger in order to settle down. And we saw how those are met in Jesus. They are met in Christ. That Jesus is the fulfillment and the embodiment of the Good Shepherd Himself. He even calls Himself the Good Shepherd, does He not? I am the Good Shepherd, and my sheep listen to my voice. To be settled down is important And we need that first and foremost. To be settled down means we can focus in. It means we're not distracted anymore. It means we're not consumed. It doesn't mean that all the worries all of a sudden go away. That doesn't happen in a life of faith, does it? I have yet to meet someone who follows Jesus who said, the moment I followed Jesus, I was free of any kind of fear and problem, and everything was sunshine and beautiful all the time. Have you ever met anybody like that? No. Every one of us following Jesus, we go through seasons of green pastures, still waters, and the valley of the shadow of death. Do we not? And we're always in one of those kinds of settings. Always. But to be settled down in green pastures is a way of saying, Lord, I trust you to handle this. And I don't want to get in your way. And one of the examples I used with you last week was that of Ruth, that Old Testament story of covenant. And how at the end of the story, when Ruth had every opportunity to go to the city gate to make sure the kinsman redeemer was going to do what he promised he would do, she said, no, Yahweh will handle this. Yahweh will take care of it. And I have nothing to worry about. So being settled down, that's what it means. But there's still more to the psalm, isn't there? I mean, that's just the opening part. And we could spend weeks probing into that and diving into what does all this mean in our lives. I pray that as we're going through Psalm 23, that you are seeing it again for the first time. That you're catching a glimpse of this view of who Yahweh is and the effect that a relationship with Him has. This psalm is so much more about living than it is dying. Even though we most often hear this psalm at funerals or memorial services, it's so much more about living. And living in a covenantal relationship with Yahweh, our shepherd. Regardless of where you happen to be in life right now, Psalm 23 applies. Regardless of where you are, Psalm 23 applies. The psalm has become a confession of faith because I know the Lord is my shepherd. A very personal relationship. And as we journey with the shepherd, we begin to discover the depth of trust. The depth of trust that can be placed in the shepherd. I want you to remember that only the shepherd can meet and fulfill the needs of the sheep. Only the shepherd can do that. And in order for that to happen, in order for the shepherd to come in and meet the need, there has to be trust. There has to be. It won't work any other way. I want us to do what we've done the last several weeks, and let's read the 23rd Psalm together as printed there from the King James Version. It's printed there on your handout. If you don't have a handout yet, handouts and prayer sheets are at the back table as you come in the fellowship center. Let's read this together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for Thou art with me. Thy rod and Thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Have you ever noticed how much we are on the move? That we're always going and going and going and doing. In fact, because of our means of transportation, this gigantic globe we live on has become pretty small. And thanks to air travel and all kinds of other means of transportation, you can be nearly anywhere in the world in really a day, day and a half. It really doesn't take that long. When you consider the number of miles that you travel, it's really not a long time to get there. But have you ever thought about how many miles you drive in a year? You ever thought about that? Most of it, I know we get in the car and we just go. And we really don't think about the number of miles that are being racked up on a vehicle. Well, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Administration, the average American driver drives 14,263 miles a year. Just over 14,000 miles a year. You break that down, it's a little over 1,000 miles a month, right? So that's a lot of driving. You consider mile after mile after mile. And that's actually up. That's the most recent statistic. That's actually up from several years ago. 7 years ago, actually, the average number of miles driven by the average American driver was 13,476. So in 7 years' time, the average American driver has driven almost 800 miles a year more. That's a lot of driving, is it not? Stop and think about that for a minute. Well, in January of 2020, not too long before the pandemic began, our family traded vehicles. We needed something larger that we could carry the circus in with us so we could all load in together. And so we traded vehicles, and the vehicle that we traded for at the time had 48,000 miles on it. 48,000 miles in January of 2020. Now, just over 3 years later, it has 96,500 miles on it. And that's just one of the vehicles we have. Now, you take that and start doing the math and breaking it apart, that comes out to just over 16,000 miles a year for the Rawls family in one vehicle. That's a lot of mileage. That's a lot of rotations on those tires. We spend a lot of time in the car. We really do. A transient family kind of moving along, here we go, here and there, activities and the like. From right here at the church to our house over in Bethlehem, it's a 6-mile drive. Round trip, that's 12. Rana drives it, I drive it. That's 24 miles a day at least that we know we're going to drive. You start doing that, it starts adding up, doesn't it? And then you start thinking about trips, and you start thinking about going somewhere. You start thinking about doing something, and I can't tell you the number of times, and I know you remember this. As parents, you remember hearing from the back seat as you're driving down the road and you're going to your destination, you will hear, "I'm thirsty," right? You will hear, "I'm hungry." And it always seems to happen when you are on the stretch of road where there is nothing for miles and miles and miles. Can I get an amen on that? Please? It always happens that way, right? When we are traveling, when we are on the go, we're always looking for nourishment. And we can say, well, you just ate 15 minutes ago, and you're already hungry again. And if we stop and get you something to drink because you're thirsty, in 30 minutes, we're going to have to stop again because you drank that entire bottle of water in the back seat of the car. And we're going to have to make another stop. It never fails. When we're on the move, we need nourishment, don't we? We always do. In Psalm 23, we have discovered that the identity of the always faithful, ever-present shepherd is leading to green pastures, and how being led to green pastures and settling down there is a satisfaction for the soul, a nourishment for deep in the soul, and it leaves us wanting nothing because Yahweh is. Yahweh is. Therefore I have all I need. But then there's the next line. The next line, after he settles me down in green pastures, what is the next line in the 23rd Psalm? He leads me beside still waters, right? That's where I want us to settle in this evening. The psalmist describes that the shepherd is leading. Now, that's a natural duty for the shepherd. That's a natural responsibility. That's something you expect the shepherd to do with the flock, to lead the flock along, to lead the flock to where they need to go. The verb that's used here in Psalm 23, verse 2, is nahal, which means to guide or to bring along or to lead. The sheep, though, have to trust the shepherd. And the shepherd's reputation is what leads them along and builds that trust. Because the sheep know the shepherd will not lead me into something that's dangerous. I may lead myself there, but if I follow that shepherd, I don't have to worry because I'm going to be protected, I'm going to be provided for. It's there. If I will follow where the shepherd leads. The shepherd knows where to go. The shepherd has the bigger picture in mind. And remember, this is Yahweh, the God of the covenant, the God of the Exodus, the name first revealed to Moses at the burning bush. The Exodus, formative moment in the life of the people of Israel as they're called out of Egypt, and they have to trust God, do they not? As they leave Egypt, where they had all the pots of meat and all the fruits and all the vegetables and all the water they had everything they wanted, and they were in bondage and slavery, but they had all the provisions they wanted, and now they're going out into the desert, and they're following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because Moses has come in and said, Pharaoh, let my people go. Let them go. They have to trust the Lord because they're going into the desert where there is absolutely nothing. They have to depend upon their shepherd. There are plenty of times when they want to turn back, plenty of times when they have no food, times when they have no water, times when their enemies are closing in around them, times when they don't know how they're going to make it. But they keep pressing forward and Yahweh keeps leading them. The root of the verb, nahal, in Hebrew, used by the psalmist, it occurs elsewhere in the Old Testament. You find it scattered throughout the Old Testament. In fact, shortly into the journey of the Hebrews as they come out of Egypt and they're learning to trust their shepherd, they learn what it means for Yahweh to lead them. Go to Exodus 13 with me. Exodus 13, verses 20 through 22. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Now, when you see there that verb in the New International Version, the verb to guide in verse 21, that's the verb nahal, to lead, to guide, to bring alongside. But I want you to notice in verse 22, neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. This means as they're moving out into this unknown, the place where they have never been before, a place where they never knew even existed because they'd been in Egypt for generations. They didn't know this was out there, and there's nothing to be seen and nothing to be had, but all they need is the pillar of cloud by day. All they need is the pillar of fire by night. Why? Because Yahweh's leading them. Yahweh's guiding them. And He's proven Himself to be faithful and trustworthy and true. Sometimes we think that God is not leading. Sometimes we think God is even absent in a moment. It was the case for the people just a few verses later when they think the Egyptians are going to kill them. Look at Exodus 14:11. As the Egyptians are kind of pushing in around them and they're coming up against the Red Sea, Exodus 14:11. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Where is the Lord now? Our enemies are closing in around us." But I want you to know, church, God's already there. God's already in the midst of it. God already sees the need before they realize they've got a need. And God is ready to do what needs to be done if they will follow Him, if they will do what He tells them to do. God was, God is, God will be. That's in essence what Yahweh means. The eternally faithful, always the same one. God was in the past, God is in the present, God will be in the future. All at the same time. So when the psalmist in Psalm 23 speaks of the shepherd leading, this is exactly what comes to mind. Just as Yahweh led our ancestors through the desert, and they kept an eye on His presence, by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, we know Yahweh is leading. He is still present and still out front. And it's an important distinction to make that the shepherd is out front leading the flock. The shepherd is out there and the sheep follow in that direction. To lead is not the same thing as to drive, because to drive implies force. Leading implies you go out and the sheep follow. Ken Bailey, the late Dr. Ken Bailey, says in a wonderful book titled The Good Shepherd, and it's a book that connects 23rd Psalm with the ministry of Jesus. Here's what he writes. "The Good Shepherd leads me. He does not drive me." There's a marked difference. In Egypt, where there is no open pasture land, I have often seen shepherds driving their sheep from behind with sticks. But in the open wilderness of the Holy Land, the shepherd walks slowly ahead of his sheep and either plays his own 10-second tune on a pipe, or more often sings his own unique call. The sheep appear to be attracted primarily to the voice of the shepherd, which they know and are eager to follow. Listen to that. The sheep hear the voice of the shepherd, which they know and they are eager to follow. And the shepherd is gently walking in front of them, calling them along, and they fall right in line with where the shepherd goes. It's a relationship of intimacy that the sheep has with the shepherd. It's a relationship of knowing one another. And it's connected by the voice of the shepherd. The voice of the shepherd. When the people arrive eventually at Sinai, after leaving Egypt, they are met by the voice of God. And it settles them down for a time being. It's there where they learn to listen to His voice and follow where He leads. I don't know about you, but that just has Jesus written all over it, doesn't it? In John chapter 10, Jesus talks about and he says, I am the good shepherd. I am. It's one of the I am statements in the Gospel of John. I am the good shepherd. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. They have learned to hear my voice. They've learned to recognize my voice and the song that I'm singing, and they follow. I am the good shepherd, and my sheep know my voice. The psalmist speaks of leading. He leadeth me beside the still waters. And there's a directional movement involved there. It's not a sitting still, is it? Being led, it's not sitting still. It's moving along, plodding along, little by little, and it's not fast, but it's a continual movement. But where? Where are we going? I wonder, I really do wonder, what it must have been like among the camps, among the Israelites as they left Egypt. And as the folks talked amongst one another, and Egypt was further and further in the rearview mirror until finally they could see it no longer. And now they're out in the middle of the desert. And I wonder what the conversations must have been like. Now we have a glimpse here. Moses, you brought us out here to die, right? What are you doing? What were you thinking? But I wonder if they also said, I just wonder where this fella's taken us. You ever thought about that? What they must have murmured amongst themselves? Where does he think he's going? Where is he taking us? And why are we following him? Because we don't have anything out here. What are we thinking? There's an element of faith and trust involved there, right? And a relationship that's been built. The sheep trust the shepherd. The previous clause speaks to food and green pastures. He settles me down in green pastures, beautiful pasture lands. And we saw last week how a sheep will only lay down and settle down in green pastures when the sheep has already had its fill of it's no longer hungry. And then he'll lay down. And now we learn this. He leads me beside still waters. Philip Keller points out in A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23 that sheep have a way of surviving even in dry climate. Even in a very dry climate, such as the Middle East and the Holy Land, sheep can survive. Keller writes, sheep by habit rise just before dawn and they start to feed. Or if there is bright moonlight, they will graze at night. The early hours are when the vegetation is drenched with dew. And sheep can they can take their fill on the amount of water taken in with their tongue, and then they forage around and they graze just before and just after dawn. They can survive in drier climates because the vegetation has dew on it in the morning. And while survival with low amounts of water is possible, it's also not ideal, is it? You really can't survive too long. You still need to have a supply of water. But the shepherd knows where sources of water can be found. And in between the sources of water, the sheep are provided for and they have what they need. From well to well, from stream to stream, and in between, the shepherd is able to provide everything the sheep need. You and I cannot survive without water, can we? It's simply not possible. That's a problem that the ancient Hebrews faced in the Exodus. They had a problem, a water problem. They came to a place where there was no water. Look at Exodus 17 for a moment. We've kind of seen how this motif of the shepherd leading in the Exodus is working its way through. In Exodus 13, being brought out into the wilderness to follow. By Exodus 14, we're being pressed up against the Red Sea, and the sea parts and the people cross on dry land. Exodus 15 is a song of praise from Moses and Miriam unto the Lord for what the Lord has just done. Then we come to Exodus 16, where they're in a desert place in a wilderness and they have nothing to eat. And what does the Lord do when they have nothing to eat? There's manna from heaven, right? All of Exodus 16 deals with the manna that falls from heaven. And then we come to Exodus 17. Read the first 7 verses with me. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin and traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink, so they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against Moses, and they said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" So now it's not just me. Now it's my children and my livestock that you're killing too. This is becoming a real problem, Moses. A real problem. And we have a trust issue here, don't we? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." I bet they were by the time they're in that spot. The Lord answered Moses, "Walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" The people are about to starve. God provides manna and quail in Exodus 16. Now they're about to thirst, and God does what only God can do, right? And provides. But I want you to notice it's the presence of the shepherd that calms even Moses. Because Moses says to the Lord, "These people are going to kill me for what's happening to them. This keeps happening. Your reputation, Yahweh, my reputation is on the line now. They're coming after me." Yahweh says, "Go to where I show you to go, and I'll be right there. I'll be there. And do what I tell you to do, and everything will be okay." But the people were asking the question, is Yahweh among us or not? Because we seem to go from a really high mountaintop to a really low valley, and then back to a really high mountaintop, and then a really low valley. You're really testing us here. That's faith, is it not? Because we're always in between mountaintops and valleys. Right? Isn't that right? Life always goes back and forth between mountaintop and valley. Is Yahweh with us or not? Sometimes we question the presence of God, and we wonder, "God, where are you? Where are you? I thought we were following you." And this is turning out to be a lot different than we thought it would be. We question where we are when things are dry and there's nothing to drink. But we must remember that the Lord is leading. Even in seasons of dryness, the Lord leads. And the Lord is still present, and the Lord is still speaking. Here's the thing, church. Like we saw last week, what you may see as a desert around you, that there is no way in the world that anything good could come from the place you find yourself in. You may see a desert, but I do believe that Yahweh can see a green pasture. I believe that. You may see a dry, barren land with nothing to drink. But Yahweh sees a stream of living water. A stream of living water. Well, how can you say that, Andrew? How do you know that? How do you believe that? Well, I know this much to be true. The same God who created the universe and set those rivers and streams and oceans in their place, He has wells of living water that we have not yet seen. If He can create all the water that's on the earth covered by two-thirds covered by water, right? If the Lord can do that, the Lord can provide anything. Amen? It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's dry and parched. You may see a desert, but what God sees is a fertile soil with living water to bear fruit of righteousness and resurrection. That's what Yahweh can do when we follow. It's powerful. This is powerful, church. Jesus meets our needs. But there's one more thing to think about in terms of the water. What kind of water is it? It's still water. Still water. In his beautiful book on the 23rd Psalm, George Lambsa writes about sheep, that sheep cannot be watered at places where the water is swift. If the water is swiftly flowing, the sheep cannot drink. Why? Because it impairs other senses. They don't hear as well with that flowing, rushing water. They need calmer waters. And they need calmer waters not only to hear threats that may be around them, they need calmer waters to hear their shepherd when their shepherd begins to sing and say, "Come on, it's time to go." They need to be able to hear. The water needs to be as still as the grass needs to be as green. It's beautiful, beautiful picture. Sheep are skittish. They can be scared at a moment's notice. And when the water is still, a sheep can drink without the fear of being attacked, without the fear of being pressed in upon, and can hear the voice of the shepherd. I want you to notice the difference between the two verbs in Psalm 23:2. He settles me down and He leads me. Do you see that? He settles me down and He leads me. Everybody say that. He settles me down, He leads me. Now let's say it again. Say it to your neighbor. He settles me down, He leads me. There's a difference between the two. Because one is still. I'm settled down and I'm in place. The other is a description of movement, right? So with one, you've got He's settling me down to rest. With the other, He's leading me and I'm going somewhere with Him. But I want you to notice this, church. It's the shepherd who's doing both. Whether you are staying or whether you are going, whether you are settling down or whether you are following, it's the presence of the shepherd that you're looking to. Do you see that? You see the connection? Sometimes we are in seasons of stillness where we need to sit where we are and simply remain right there. Other times, the Lord is moving and we need to go where He's going. We learn about the tabernacle in the book of Exodus that when the cloud came upon it, and that signified the presence of God, the presence of the Holy One, when the cloud stayed there, the people stayed right there. But when the cloud began to move, the people began to move. But the cloud never changed. It didn't change in substance. It didn't change in function. The function was this. It's the presence of God. The substance is this. It's the presence of God. Either way, it's the presence of God. You follow me? Either way. Still waters leading me there or settling me down in green pastures. Look at Psalm 121 with me. One of the Psalms of Ascents. And I want you to notice in particular, keep that thought in mind, whether I'm staying or going. Psalm 121, I lift up my eyes unto the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. Your coming and your going, and everything in between, the Lord watches over. Whether He's settling you down in green pastures or He's leading you on to still waters, it's the same shepherd in both situations. The same. Flip over to the New Testament, to the book of Mark. The Gospel of Mark. In chapter 4, Jesus has been teaching His disciples a lot about faith and what it means to follow Him. He says that faith is like a seed that grows. He also says that faith is like a mustard seed that's very tiny, but when it takes root, it produces something very large. And as soon as Jesus finishes teaching, He tells the disciples that they're going to go somewhere. Mark chapter 4, picking up in verse 35. That day, when the evening came, He said to His disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake. He's leading them somewhere, right? Now they're on the move. Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along just as He was. He was in the boat. And there were also other boats with them. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke Him and said to Him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to His disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey Him. Now, Jesus and the disciples have been on the move. They've had a lot to happen. Jesus has taught a lot, and they've seen things happening. And then Jesus says, all right, guys, it's time to go. Let's get back on the move. And we're going to go to the other side of the lake. So Jesus was already in the boat. He was already teaching. So they hop in the boat, and they set off across the lake. And then a serious squall pops up. A storm seems to come out of nowhere. In that region, it can happen at the drop of a hat. Happens often. Where is Jesus? He's sleeping. It's almost like the ancient Israelites. Is Yahweh with us or not? Do we need to go wake Him up and tell Him we've got a problem here? He's sleeping. He's awakened by the frantic sheep who have got themselves worked up into a tizzy. Now, it must have been quite the storm because many of Jesus' disciples were fishermen, and so they would have known the lake, they would have known the sea, they would have been familiar with it. It must have been quite the storm. Something that they were fearful of, that they could not handle on their own. Don't you care if we drown? Doesn't our shepherd care that his sheep are about to be swallowed up by the water? Is Yahweh with us or not? We have the same problem they had, don't we? The very same problem that they had. The disciples cannot still the waters on their own. And guess what, loved one? Neither can you. You can't still the waters that rage around you. You don't have the power to do that. You don't have the authority to do that. But hear this carefully. you're a part of the flock of the Good Shepherd, He has the authority. He has the power. With one word, He stills it all. And we don't have to wake Him up. He's already paying attention. He knows. He knows where we are and what we're doing. What does Jesus do with the wind and the waves? English translations do a really poor job of translating the Greek at this point. Because Jesus doesn't just say, "Be quiet, you angry waves." That's not the force with which the living Word speaks to creation. To properly translate it, Jesus says, "Shut up. I've had enough." There's a strong emphasis there and a punch. Jesus is looking at these waves that are out of control, and He says, "Shut up. I've had it." And immediately, the wind and the waves die down. And they fall into place, proper order, under the voice of God. The faithful presence of Yahweh is there. How does this translate? What do we see? How do we live this out in our daily lives? 15 years ago, at this very moment, my siblings and I were gathered together. And we were gathered in a waiting room at Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem. 15 years ago, right about now. 15 years ago. It was just a few hours earlier that we had learned that Mom had passed in a car accident. And so we were reeling in shock, and Dad had been carted off to surgery. Lots of broken bones, lots of hurt, lots of pain. One of the last things I remember my father speaking aloud, I've never even shared this in public. One of the last things I remember him saying aloud, my younger brother and I were in the pre-op area, and the surgeon, anesthesiologist, came in to talk to my dad and say, "Reverend Rawls, we're going to have to do some pretty major surgery on you. You've got lots of broken bones that we've got to set from this accident. But don't worry. We're going to get you fixed up. We're going to get you healed up." Knowing that my mother was already gone, my father said, "Doc, I'm sorry, but you can't heal the hurt I've got." It's deep. That's painful. There we gathered in a waiting room. And there must have been 100 people who showed up. From years and years, various churches where Dad had been pastor. And people showed up and they gathered around us. And there we were holding on, wanting some kind of word from the doctor. The surgery went well, that he would be okay. And as you know, I've shared my story with you before. He died 11 days later. But the storm was raging inside. And it was hard. It was hard to deal with. I felt like my siblings and I had gotten on this boat, and we found Jesus sleeping at the wheel. Where are you? Where are you? Are you here? Are you not? The darkness of the valley of the shadow of death descended upon us quickly in that moment. Now, I'll tell you, I still hold to the conviction that God did not cause that accident to happen. I believe that. He did not cause that to happen. That was not part of the will of God. Death is never part of the will of God. It's not. Not death with all its fear and troubles as we know it. It's not. But it was senseless. It was reasonless. at the same time, I hold that in tension with this, that the same God who called light out of darkness at creation, the same God who raised Jesus from the dead on the third day, is the same God that can pull light out of any dark situation and cause there to be meaning and purpose and resurrection out of what has died. That is gospel truth. And I held to the truth, the fact, God can do that here. I don't know how. I don't know what. But I know God can do it. I can tell you this too. That night 15 years ago, and lots of times since, just like you, I have said, Yahweh, are you here or not? Are you here or not? And I wondered how in the world we would ever settle down in green pastures ever again, because the storm was that raging and intense. I will say this. The only thing that sustained my life in the days that surrounded that event and in the years since has been the sweet presence of Jesus. That's it. That's it. And I'm not trying to be preachy. I'm not trying to be super Christian. I'm just saying. That's the only thing. The presence of the shepherd. When the storm is raging and we see no way out and we call out, "Where are you?" I'm right here. I'm right here. This much I know, and I believe this. Yahweh has never left our side. And He's never left yours either. He's present. Whatever the storm, whatever the problem, whatever the situation, whatever the desert, whatever the barrenness, whatever it might be, Yahweh is present. And Yahweh is faithful. And Yahweh is trustworthy. The waters have been stilled, of course. From time to time, they seem to flow again. But here we are 15 years later, and I can tell you, I share this story as a testimony to Yahweh's faithfulness, not to Andrew's goodness. It's Yahweh's faithfulness. Just as the shepherd causes us to settle down in green grass, the shepherd causes the waters to become still around us, that we find what we need, and He will lead us there. Jesus spoke loudly and firmly to the wind and the waves that day from the boat. And the water and the wind became still, right? It died down immediately at the sound of His voice. When the shepherd spoke, the storm stopped. Listen to His voice. Draw to His side. There are times when we say, "Are you here or not?" But we know from our own testimony of faith, He has been ever present and ever faithful, never once dropping the ball. Always the same and always present. The relationship with our shepherd brings us to still waters. And I ask you, what is it in your own life that needs that kind of touch? That needs that kind of stillness about you and a settledness? The only thing that can do it, I believe it, the only thing that will settle that is the voice of the living God. And you have to listen. Listen to the voice of God. The shepherd will take care of those raging waters by speaking, settled by the shepherd himself. It's almost as if the Lord is saying, I'm leading you to waters that I have already stilled, and I will still them. Follow my voice. Listen to me. You may not be able to see where you are. You may not be able to see where you're going. You may not even be able to see where you've been. But listen to the voice of the shepherd. Listen for the voice of the shepherd. And I promise that sweet, gentle, powerful, storm-stilling voice will do the same thing today it did then. As we've done every week so far, I want to close by reading the 23rd Psalm in reverse order. I will dwell in the house of Yahweh forever. Surely goodness and Yahweh's faithful love will follow me all the days of my life. My cup runneth over. Thou anointest my head with oil, and in the presence of mine enemies you have prepared a table before me. Thy rod and staff comfort me. Thou art with me. So I will fear no evil, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. For his name's sake he leads me in paths of righteousness. He restoreth my soul. My shepherd, Yahweh is, so I lack nothing. He settles me down in green pastures. His voice stills the water and leads me there. Will you pray with me? Oh, eternal and living God, we thank you this night to be together as your people. And we thank you that you are still in the business of calming storms. And I pray in the power of the Holy Spirit this night that whatever waters need to be stilled, that your gentle voice will do so. May we hear you and hear your voice and follow you wherever you lead. And now, as Christ hath taught us, we are bold to say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you, church. Go in peace.